So the only way that we can teach, the only way that we can lead is by showing clear successes. If we want to lead, we have to succeed. Otherwise, people will be happy to have us as a market, as somebody to sell cars to.
Lights, Camera, Azadi is a show that is on a quest to meet personalities. The personalities who have always challenged the status quo. These people are courageous and confident to speak the truth and are best at it. Though the world may or may not agree with them, they always work for nation building. We want to talk to them and understand their perspective. We want to know their worldview, their thoughts, and what gaps do they see in the society, and most importantly, how to live life fearlessly. My name is Vandit Jain, and I am just a medium to get these stories to you. As you all know, Lights Camera Azadi is a non commercial, volunteer driven podcast as of now. One such volunteer is Abhishek Shah. Abhishek helps me in editing the episodes, especially the ones which have poor audio quality. He has helped me at odd hours and in urgent situation. I would like to take this opportunity to thank Abhishek. He himself is a host of an amazing podcast on social science, Research Radio. Go check it out. Welcome to another special episode of Lights Camera Azadi. Today I will be speaking to a special guest, Omair Ahmad. Omair is the managing editor South Asia of the Third Pole, which is a project dedicated to water issues of the Himalayan region. I reached Omair through Twitter. Actually, it's an interesting story. Omair keeps on writing these amazing Twitter threads on India's foreign relations. One such thread became super popular, and I thought I will ask Omair if he is free for a chat. One of the signs I see in a guest is his or her approachability. Omair was so humble, he himself messaged me and gave me his email ID. I had such a brilliant conversation with him, and I started looking at international relations in a completely new light. He explained such complex concepts with such simplicity, it was just great. This is another sign of a great guest. Well, without further ado, let's tune into Omair Ahmad. So, 3, 2, 1. Omair Ahmad, welcome to Lights Camera Azadi.
Thank you for having me on this.
Omair, talk to us about your tryst with international relations and how did it begin?
Okay, well, basically, like many other Indian kids, I was a science student. My dad was an engineer, my granddad was a doctor, my mom had an MSc in geography. So, it's all very much the middle class science thing. And unfortunately for me, I guess I was good at it in the sense that I enjoyed physics, and my school allowed me to do accelerated physics and calculus, and I enjoyed that. But by the end of my school term, this was the early 90s, and you had the whole Ram Janmabhoomi stuff and everything else going on. You had the Balkans War, you had Rwanda, not that much around that time. And I realized I understood nothing of it. And so I argued with my parents, saying that I wanted to shift fields. But I didn't have a good idea what I wanted to do. So I couldn't convince them, which is more my fault than theirs. So I actually ended up joining my science classes and then just not doing them, flunking out, then saying, okay, I want to do international relations and understand politics and political science.
That was a
So
good shift.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure. Maybe I should have stuck with. I miss my maths. I miss my physics. Though they had a certain clarity of vision that is not there when you discuss social science, and it is less contested territory. And also my brain doesn't work as well anymore. So even if I go back to reading a lot of contemporary physics stuff, like Lee Smolins' writings and all, which I enjoy, but I realize that I don't have the maths anymore to actually follow those arguments as well as I would like. So I feel really dumb. But that's a choice you make. You shift from one field to another. And I realized initially I thought the foreign service was where I wanted to be, but then I also realized I'm not very good at following orders from people I don't think are smart. Uh, and I thought then that the civil service was just not going to do it for me. Um, so I, I chose a slightly different way of going about it. Um, And then while I was, I mean, I got into JNU, which has the best international relations program in India. And the international relations program in JNU actually precedes JNU. The School of International Studies was founded before JNU was founded and was incorporated into it afterwards. It was built to create foreign policy stuff. Um, but I was doing my MPhil when one of the top people from the US, from the Council of Foreign Relations, was visiting. And because JNU is a top ranked international relations school, he came to give us a talk. And this is in 2000. And I remember talking to him at that time because the Clinton administration, after the nuclear tests in India and Pakistan, had said something about China being, maintaining the peace in the region, which of course pissed all of us off a lot. And so we asked about this, and he talked about India as a possible junior partner to the U.S., which to me, frankly, annoyed me that much more. I later learned that he was a person who was used to making more provocative comments, uh, but to keep the conversation going. But I also realized that I needed, if I had to understand international relations, I needed to understand how America made its policies because it's such a large actor. So I did a second master's in the US. And frankly, in terms of theory and academia, I'd already learned what I needed to do in JNU. But what I learned a lot in the US was doing internships at various of the top think tanks in DC. National Endowment for Democracy, the Center for Strategic International Studies, the AG Foundation. I worked for a while with the Voice of America as a researcher. And so technically, I was a Department of Defense contractor while doing that, which is kind of funny. And and then I came back to India, and there was hard work trying to find a job that would do that because we don't really have much in terms of a foreign policy discourse. We now have a few more think tanks. The ICWA has been around for a while. The ORF has now pushed the Raisena dialogue into a limelight, but comparatively, we have a fairly limited landscape when it comes to actual work or international relations. So either you're with one or two think tanks, either government linked, government inclined, or uh, you are nowhere. So either you go into journalism or you go into something else, and or you work with foreign agencies in some form or the other. So I did a bit of all of these. I worked with the Center for Policy Research. I worked as part of the PRS Legislative Research Initiative. I worked as a journalist. I worked at the British High Commission as a political advisor. I spent a year in the UK while researching a book that I've always wanted to write on the Balkans War and applying for a PhD on that subject. I got into the PhD, but I couldn't get the scholarships necessary to do that, and it's really difficult if you're South Asian and you want to study the Balkans. It's very expensive. And I remember in the US when I was there and I was doing this, and my professor said, you can do this, but you can do this only with the intelligence agencies. And I was like, huh. And the CIA was recruiting people of, let's say, my background, brown people who could speak Urdu, that type of thing. Uh, but that just, I didn't want to salute an American flag, to be honest, and it didn't really make it for me. I mean, and one of the things which I learned about foreign policy making in America, which I also learned when I worked with, let's say, the Conservative Party briefly in the UK, was how local most of these issues are. we think of foreign policy as these, kind of nerdy eggheads looking at the globe. But in actual truth of fact, what happens is there are very specific drivers for foreign policy which are extremely local. So let's say a company like Raytheon, which makes missiles, also provides jobs for a particular state, and the senator of that particular state will push um, things for Raytheon, not because it's not necessarily that he's a votary for Raytheon, but because he wants jobs for his state and therefore taxes for his state. It was very useful for me to understand how local and how, in a sense, almost parochial were the reasons why foreign policy making happened. And I just wasn't really that interested in the parochial politics of the US. I mean, if I was going to be parochial, I might as well be parochial in India.
In India, correct.
Yeah. So that's kind of a short summary of how I got where I got.
Right now, what are the different projects that you're taking?
Right now, my primary job is the South Asia editor of the Third Pole. And the Third Pole basically reports on the four major transboundary rivers of the Himalayas. This is the Indus,
Hmm.
the Ganga, the Brahmaputra, and the Mekong. And
Hmm.
these rivers impact Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, Nepal, China,
China.
Bhutan, Bangladesh, Burma, and of course, other parts of the Mekong. And so a lot of my work has been on the two Himalayan borders of India, the eastern border with China. So I've worked on Tibetan issues, on Bhutan, and on the western border, Kashmir and Indo-Pak. And so this allows me to look at these issues from a very granular level, from looking at the people who are on these borders rather than looking at it from capitals and the discourse from newspapers or think tanks or whatever, which tend to be in capital cities but often ignore what people on the ground end up experiencing.
So
So
it's more like it doesn't matter what New Delhi or Islamabad or Beijing would be talking about the river crisis, or in maybe an Indus water treaty, but what is happening in that particular village in Punjab or in Nepal or in Bhutan because of that. Is that is that a is that correct explanation?
no, it matters very much what Islamabad, New Delhi, Beijing, Dhaka, Kathmandu are talking about. But how it plays out on the ground is something else altogether, quite often. So, for
Hmm.
example, we did this very interesting story on two small villages on the Bihar Nepal border.
Hmm.
And both of these villages shared this small river from which they got water, and they managed to deal with issues with each other. Over time, water in that river has come down for a variety of reasons. And now, what has happened is that the conflict has come to the level where they have reached out to their higher ups. They can't manage it. Now, the problem
Hmm.
is their higher ups can't do anything about an international boundary issue. That
Correct.
that issue has now gone to Kathmandu and Delhi. And which bureaucrat has the time and the expertise sitting in Delhi or Kathmandu to understand two small villages on the Bihar Nepal border? And therefore, that problem cannot be sorted out. Yeah, so it does matter very much what India and Nepal do at um at in Kathmandu and New Delhi. But for Indians living on the border, it quite often is more of a hurdle because they are not visible to New Delhi or Kathmandu.
Hmm. So, and you're trying to get those stories out.
Yeah, so our job is basically to train up journalists from within those regions so they can be reporting in. It's not us reporting on that. It's people from those areas reporting on that.
Somebody who is relevant in the government has picked up a lot of your stories and taken action over it.
Um, Once in a while. So our Indus Water Commissioner had a presentation a couple of months ago, and of the I think five stories he cited, three were from third pole, which was interesting.
Wow.
That's nice. It's an acknowledgement, right? The the advisor to the Pakistani Prime Minister on climate change, I forget his name, Malik Aslam Khan, I think, long name, wrote a piece for us, asked us if we would be interested in a piece on Pakistan's new green stimulus. So we were like quite happy, that's pretty big. I mean, he could have gone to Dawn or any of the other big publications, and they'd
Of
be happy
course.
to publish. So it was nice for him to reach out to us. So it's we have a certain specific. We're not Indian Express. We're not the Hindu. We're not New York Times. We can't do those stories. We don't have the money or the manpower to do that. But what we can do is really look at these kind of interesting stories along the borders. Let me give you
Yeah.
another example. So every year, the northern city of Norway, Tromsø, which is in the Arctic Circle, holds a thing called the Arctic Frontiers Conference, in which you have policymakers from all of the Arctic countries and all the countries that are interested in the Arctic, as well as academics and scientists and everybody else. And so I was there a year, 2 years ago. And so I'm sitting talking to a Chinese academic who's actually very close to the Communist Party. So he's as much as academic as a policymaker. And, somebody from the Norwegian Foreign Ministry. And we're talking about how you move forward in the Himalayan region. And so the Chinese academic says, the problem for China is if we initiate anything, people immediately assume this is China trying to control the conversation. And I said, well, it's the same thing for India. If India pushes something in the Himalayan region, all of the other countries that surround us keep thinking that, it's a Indian initiative. So there's a pull and push factor. In the Arctic, what you basically had is the Arctic leadership has been led by the smaller countries, and both the U.S. and the USSR are now Russia are Arctic countries, so it's not as if there isn't conflict there as well. But cooperation in the Arctic region has been driven by smaller countries such as Norway, and therefore it's less resented, and is there's less suspicion around it.
Wonderful strategy.
We could try to do something similar in the Himalayas, but it would require thinking.
Let maybe Nepal, Bhutan, they let manage the conversations there.
Yeah, but they require. I mean, the significant. I mean, what was very interesting at that point was there was an Arctic mayors conference. So mayors from major countries in the Arctic region talked about how to cooperate because they were the ones primarily impacted. And I thought, hey, wouldn't it be interesting if we got, like, say, the mayor of Kathmandu, the mayor of Srinagar, the mayor of Itanagar, the mayor of, Gangtok, the mayor of Thimphu to sit down and talk. I mean, these are major cities, very heavily impacted by climate change, but they're not part of a conversation. And the significant difference is between the countries there and the countries here. And there are two significant differences. One is of resource. The Arctic is a very rich resource in terms of fishing, in terms of oil, in terms of a lot of trade. And so there's a lot of possibility of cooperation. The Himalayan region could be an area of trade and cooperation, but frankly, we don't trade across our borders. Not that much. Not along those regions as much as we should be. There isn't an institution of trading. The other factor is that because the institution of mayors in many of the smaller countries such as Denmark, such as Norway, Finland, whatever, uh, these they're very established characters. In India, the mayors of or India or anywhere in South Asia, the mayor of even a major city is frankly nobody.
Totally.
Yeah. So these
Yep.
things may we have to think of why that opportunity exists there and why it doesn't exist here, and what we need to change to make it to exist.
We're switching gears now, and we talked a lot about how different countries think and different countries manage a certain problem.
Hmm.
Coming back to our core topic of discussion, which is foreign policy, how
Hmm.
should one see foreign policy as, and what are the major levers around it,
Hmm.
and how do we look at foreign policy in the current times?
Okay, so one of the things that I would recommend for anybody who has any interest in foreign policy is to read Kenneth Waltz. Now, Kenneth Waltz had this great book called Man's State and Power. And he's part of what we call the realist or the neo realist or the structural realist school of thought. And what Waltz described is that a world which is anarchic, as in there's no boss, there's no hierarchy in the international relations world. There's no one who can tell another. There's no one country that can tell another country what to do.
Hmm.
You can only convince, bully, or you know cooperate in various manners. But there is no order in terms of the U.S. cannot tell China what to do. China cannot tell Russia what to do. Russia can't tell us what to do. We can't tell Sri Lanka or Kathmandu. We can't tell Nepal what to do. We can urge them. So one of the factors about the international system is that it is to a certain degree a non-ordered system. There isn't a structure in which somebody can order anybody to do anything. What you can do is you can build up coalitions. And this falls under what one would call constructivist school of thought. And basically, let's say you have a coalition around anti colonialism, in which India was one of the major movers post 1947. And you can continue, and if you can get enough people on board, you can convince, you can't force anybody, you can try doing things like sanctions and stuff like that. But the US and Europe have had sanctions against Iran for donkey's years. You still can't convince, you can't force them into something, but you
Yet
can
you
try
have to
to,
do it.
yeah, you can try to use force, and sanctions is a way of force. You can try to build a global coalition to let's say a coalition against terrorism, or in favor of a climate change deal like the Paris Agreement. And you can push for those type of things to happen, but it's difficult. It requires trade-offs. It requires a lot of transactional negotiations behind. It requires a high level of diplomacy.
It makes sense. So essentially, there was one time when Nehru wanted a one world government, and he said that we need to envision a one world government where UN is leading the world and collectively governing the world. So that sort of idea is definitely off the table, and that.
So okay, so there's a couple of things into that. I would be very I haven't read anywhere where Nehru said that the UN should govern the world. Um, but where he had a very strong where we had a very strong interest, and which continues to be a part of India's foreign policy, is that as a country that didn't want to get involved in wars led by other people, one of the best ways to actually deal with crises is through a legal bureaucratic manner.
Mhm.
So, for example, after the United States the country that used to have filed the most cases in the WTO was India. And why it did so is that we pushed a kind of legal understanding of how to manage conflict. So a
Okay.
central part. Okay, so let me go back to this. A central part of Indian foreign policy thinking, pre and post independence, is the idea of Swaraj.
Hmm. Correct.
Right? I mean, one of the main issues for India is we don't want to be fighting the wars of other countries. Right? Why did we need to send millions of Indian soldiers to fight in World War I and World War II?
World War.
Yeah. How did that benefit us? We were fighting for the freedom of the British while they were suppressing us. So the idea, so one of the reasons why the non-aligned movement, why India was one of the leading players of the non-aligned movement, is because India wanted to avoid getting entangled in the wars of other countries. We would pursue a relatively independent foreign policy, and a lot of other countries felt the same, right? Because they knew that once you were entangled into a treaty network, you didn't have a choice except to do what the big player, in those cases the US or the USSR, wanted you to do. Pakistan took a completely different position. Pakistan's main policy driver was that it would not kowtow to India. So it was willing to tie up with the US, so it would have a way to avoid kowtowing to us. But what it meant is that Pakistan became entangled with a whole series of conflicts, including its tie-ups with the Sunni Gulf states, so its conflict with Iran, uh, its conflict with the Soviet Union wasn't a conflict of its making, but it was something that came about out of its strategy in that way. We chose a different path. And so it's a and one of the ways to uh, lead in that path was to avoid getting sucked up into other people's war. So Vajpayee, even though he was from the BJP, pushed back against the American request to deploy Indian troops in the Iraq War. And so this running in our foreign policy has endured since 1947. And I mean, it's changing slightly, but it's still a very strong part of our foreign policy.
Yeah, and the paper that you sent me on
Mhm.
of Shiv Shankar Menon's, it had
Mhm.
this one great line, and I quote that India's foreign policy is to protect and secure India's integrity, citizens, values, and assets, and
Yes,
to enable the development and transformation of India into a modern nation in which every Indian can achieve his or her full potential. So I think that has been largely an overarching theme of what we want to achieve in the past 70-75 years. We have
the
not been
foreign
diverted
policy.
from that as well.
Yeah, foreign policy at the end of the day, if it does not serve domestic purpose, is useless. The whole point of foreign policy is to strengthen the state. If it's not doing that, then it's a failure. That's it.
And
I mean,
is
there's nothing.
and is this the lens? Is this the lens with which you would view each and every action of each and every government, whether there are different state visits or cooperation measures or different stances? That how is it affecting domestically?
Of course, this is the bottom line for all foreign policy. If you cannot strengthen, well, not just foreign policy, also economic policy, also any other policy that a government does. The whole point of it. So the reason why I cited Waltz is that what Waltz says is the primary actor in the international system is the state, and the whole point of a state is to strengthen itself. Now, we can talk about what that means because strengthening yourself can be done through multiple ways. One way is to strengthen your citizens, another way is to strengthen only those who are the most useful citizens, in the sense that, your oligarchs.
Hmm.
So, or you
Your
can say,
elites. Yeah.
yeah, so, people who will deliver for you. That is currently the Russian strategy, right, under Putin, which there's been there's a cooperation between the Kremlin and the top bosses in Russia. And to a certain degree, if you look at it, even the US, when
Even the US.
you have
Correct.
the bosses of Google, of Alphabet now, when they're sitting and helping the US formulate its policies, what is America doing except strengthening its oligarchs in that sense,
Hmm.
right? So, the foreign policy of a country is to strengthen the ability of its citizens, even its citizens overseas, its businesses, its trade, all of these. That is the bottom line for all policies that any government does, and that's also how you should view foreign policy. If it does not strengthen you, then it is not working. That's as
Got it.
simple as that.
But
Yeah.
I would like to go on a little technical for anybody who would like to understand that what are different roles that the bureaucracy has to play, the diplomats have to play, and the role of the Ministry of External Affairs in making all of these function, and what are different levers and actors who are playing in the background the ultimate aim. Yeah.
So the Ministry of External Affairs, what does it do? One of its primary aims is information gathering. Unless you know, so this is basics, strategy 101. Unless you know the landscape, unless you know the actors, unless you know their intentions, and unless you know what they're doing, you can't formulate good policy. So one of the major things for any foreign policy organization, any ministry, is to get good and accurate information about what's happening in the world. Who are the main players? What are the main levers on which to do? One of the once you identify once you can identify who are the players, what exactly you need, there's various aspects. How do you facilitate trade? How do you extend a loan? For example, let's say one of our greatest foreign policy successes has been, in a sense, the hydropower diplomacy with Bhutan, and that's a two-way street. It's as much on them as it is on us. But one of what India does is it helps Bhutan build hydropower dams through both grants and loans. It buys power very cheaply, and then that helps us electrify our country and to have power, right?
So
So
essentially
what
a win-win for everybody.
Yeah, so it's a win-win in a lot of ways. So the bottom line is for a better, more prosperous India, but it requires building up relationships within Bhutan. It requires identifying what are their needs, and their needs were development, but also development that didn't hurt their environment too much. And so hydropower, run of the river projects, okay, hydropower dams have their own problems. But in Bhutan's case, their problems have been less because their population has been less. So in case in case of hydropower dams in India, we've had dislocations of tens and thousands, hundreds of thousands of people, right? In Bhutan, the dislocations caused by their hydropower dams have been 30 families. Okay, so all of these things coincide. Now, what India is now also pursuing is this inland waterways project to move trade by river. And with it, what it's doing is it's linking with Nepal, Bangladesh, Bhutan on the eastern side. And so what it's doing is creating a corridor by which, let's say, landlocked countries like Bhutan and Nepal can bring their trade to Indian river depots, and these can flow through into Bangladesh and out to the world. So again, it's a win-win situation, but it's a way to strengthen Indian trade and a way to strengthen also our relationship with these countries around us. Whether it will work, it's not that easy. It's all of these things. None of this is easy. There are always problems that pop up. There's always challenges. But the reason it has to be a win win is because you cannot tell other countries what to do. You can only figure out ways that are of strategic benefit to them and to us. So, in working together, we are able to pursue our own domestic interests, which are primarily of making our citizenship more prosperous and often, unfortunately, also benefiting some big industrialists who sometimes only exploit our, our marginalized communities. So we have to be careful about that.
So countries do not have permanent friends; they have just interest. That's the old saying
That's the
in
old
foreign
saying.
policy.
Yes,
Yeah,
and there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, our foreign policy are is to serve us, and that's why it's important because a country has to be held accountable by its own people. And if you're not working in their interest, what use is it?
so, talking about similar successes like the one in Bhutan,
Hmm.
what are the biggest foreign policy successes we have had in the past 6 years?
In the past
That's a
six
tough
years,
one.
that's a tough one.
I
Um,
put it. I deliberately put a timeline.
Okay, so I one of the things that we've been able to actually that the this government has been able to do fairly well is to cultivate a very strong relationship with the Gulf countries, and
Yeah,
that's a largely positive story. I personally find it a little difficult because I'm not necessarily a fan of the governing bodies of the Gulf countries, and I fear that that's that certainly within the Emirates and Saudi Arabia right now, these are incredibly uncertain regimes. But it has been a success. We've been able to reach out very strongly, and we have a good and deep relationship with the Gulf countries. In that is we've done a fairly decent job with the Maldives in the sense that Maldives was very much becoming a Chinese client state.
correct.
So
Do Chinese have a base there yet, or were they
no, they don't
planning a
have a
base as well?
base. There was some talk of a harbor. It wasn't necessarily a base, but it would have been a much stronger potential interest. We've had some successes in partnering with Vietnam vis-a-vis China in the South China Sea, but I can't quantify that very well, to be honest. We handled Doklam largely okay, but there are significant challenges still to be addressed there. Beyond that, I really don't know what we would consider a proactive, successful strategy vis-a-vis India. We've been successful, if you wish to call it that, in blunting criticisms of our Kashmir policy in the US and Europe. But that's you could call that a foreign policy success. But to me, that's more of a that we kind of are putting band-aid on a problem that we created.
Omer, how do you think we have changed our foreign policy stance in the past decade? And it's fair to compare because in the last 10 years we have seen the UPA two, NDA one, and then 1 year of NDA two. So how do you compare the stances and the directions that we have changed, or it's largely been the same? The template has been the same.
Okay, so we went in terms of our foreign policy direction from UPA 2 to NDA 1. We went from a much more non aligned policy to one that seemed to be far, far closer to the US initially. And then towards the end of NDA 1, we shifted back towards what one would call the older foreign policy, where we were not so closely aligned to the US, where we pursued a somewhat our own pathway. But there were a couple of things that we did that were very stark. One was cutting off trade with Iran. Other was allowing American ambassadors and foreign and American senators to visit Arunachal Pradesh, which is contested by China and therefore uh, annoying China. I don't know why we did that because I'm not sure what we got out of it. I mean, I'm not a fan of China, but needling somebody is not particularly useful unless you're getting something out of it. And I'm not sure we got much out of it from the Americans.
Except maybe demonstration of some subtle relationship or soft power that we now also have allies. Maybe something like that.
Yeah, but if you want to look when it comes to how it comes to allies, what has America done for us vis-a-vis China or Pakistan or even Sri Lanka in the last few years? So what did we get? Now, possibly we did get something. I don't know. But a lot of diplomacy, a lot of what is deliverable in a lot of these things will be classified, and neither you nor I have the ability to judge that. But I'll give you a very simple measure. Where's David Headley?
Hmm. It's still there somewhere in the US, as far as we know.
As far as we know, have we gotten free and full access to him?
No, not yet.
Are we going to?
I don't think so.
And come on, more than 100 of our citizens were murdered. Don't Isn't that something that we should want?
And that's not even a discussion on the table. That's even surprising.
It's
I mean, at
nowhere,
least
right?
it's nowhere.
So if we are taking the risk of pissing off China for America to demonstrate, that all of this, at least we should get some, like, come on, yeah, our people are getting murdered, so kuch to
Hmm.
milna chahiye na. Uh, so that's I'm I so historically, India and the US have had different, very often very conflictual relationships. And the reason is not necessarily because America is bad or we're stupid or they're stupid. The thing is that their interests and our interests diverge because they're physically located in a different region. We're physically located in a different region. And
Hmm.
therefore, we pursue our I mean, if Afghanistan falls apart or Pakistan, falls apart, India will suffer the consequences. How much of those consequences will be suffered by the United States?
So it's in our interest to ensure peace and stability in the region, but that might not be in their interest.
It, yeah, it's not. They have different. They have a different. It won't be in their top 10,
Oh, okay,
right? It is in our top 10.
for sure.
Yeah.
But there has been and I'm just talking about the narratives that we hear that India has been very successful in foreign policy in the past 5 6 years, and one of the trends that we have also seen is PMO taking special interest in MEA. And honestly, like, the Ministry of External Affairs in India, one was reduced to managing the affairs through Twitter, with all respect there, and it felt like the PMO is running the Ministry of External Affairs. Was it a true sense? Was it truly like that?
No, no,
Uh,
no, not at all. If you just look at the number of embassies that grew in the time of UPA 1 and UPA 2, a lot of
hmm.
a lot of what the NDA won the last 6 years, a lot of what they're able to do is only because of the infrastructure laid down during UPA 1 and UPA 2. And the significant difference between foreign policy as seen then and foreign policy as seen now is that in this government, everything is reduced to, in a sense, optics about the prime minister. But an optics doesn't translate into what did you get, right? So one of the few successes that we've had, okay, so in the last 6 years, in what institution has India been successful? Can you name me one? I think the only one can name is the MTCR regime,
Hmm.
right? That's one in 6 years. We were able to do a far, far greater amount in terms of building, strategic dialogues with the European Union, with Germany as a strategic partner under UPA 2. So it's not the fact that you're at the table in terms of being seen with the leader of another country that is is a measure of success. It's what your measure of success is. What did you get out of it?
But isn't that feedback, feedback loop present, especially in foreign affairs, that there's not a lot that we are maybe achieving that we should be achieving. Is that feedback not present?
Well, as you say, currently the MEA is primarily run by the PMO. So, in that sense, what feedback loop? It's all coming from the top, and that makes it difficult to figure out what we're getting. Okay. Oh, so there's one thing that I would say that this government has been successful to a certain degree on, and that's the Raisena dialogues. And the Raisena dialogues are basically an initiative of ORF, but backed by the Ministry of External Affairs and the PMO. And it's the only big uh, 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 place where global leaders from across the world are sitting down to talk in the venue of a developing country. Otherwise, you have, let's say, you have a strategic dialogue that happens in Germany. You have these happening in the US. The Raisina dialogue is the only one where a developing country is playing a leading role. China doesn't have this. And a lot of that has to do with the importance of India per se. And bear in mind, the importance of India cannot be ignored. It is a country of 1.3 billion people. It is one of the largest markets in the world. People want, and it is unaligned. So people want it on their side. That's one of our greatest strengths, and that is something that has come and been sustained since 47, that we've been able to walk our own path. In that sense, one of the things that Modi says about India being a Vishwaguru, well, I mean,
Yeah, I
that's
was
a
coming
bit,
to that.
yeah, it's a bit of
Teacher
a,
of knowledge.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's a bit of a long stretch, but nevertheless, this is an idea that India has actually stood for since 47. It's not a new idea. Basically, India wanted to chart a new path, one that wasn't set by Europe, it wasn't set by the USSR, it wasn't set by anybody. And because India is so large, that it is and because it has both, let's say, space capabilities, it has some of the best science and medical facilities, it has great educational facilities. All of these, by the way, which have been set up over decades, right? These did not appear over in a day or in a year or in 10 years. They took time to build. But India also has the biggest challenges in the world. We have the largest number of poor people in the world. We have the largest number of uh, people with diseases in the world. We have the biggest biggest challenges when it comes to dealing with climate change. The way we handle our problems can be a way to show the world how it can do things. So our space program on the cheap is an inspiration. Our If we handle, let's say, disease outbreaks like the coronavirus well, then uh, it can be a teaching moment. The only state that's done that is unfortunately Kerala. Well, I mean, fortunately for Kerala, thank God. But Kerala's example is being cited by publications like The Economist, as money isn't everything. But at the root of everything comes money and power. So if you look at what countries learn from, they tend to try to look at the countries that have the most power. Right now, actually, most developing countries are far closer or learning far more from the Chinese model than they're learning from us. And the answer to that is very simple. China has been far more successful in pulling people out of poverty. It's been far more successful in becoming a richer and more powerful country. And so when China is pushing for a Belt and Road Initiative, you've got a lot more countries aligned with it. India, in the last 6 years, has been trying to push for a motor vehicles agreement in South Asia. Where has that gone? Not very far. So the only way that we can teach, the only way that we can lead, is by showing clear successes. If our own example is an example of millions of people uh, walking home in a shutdown, nobody will want to learn from that. You really, at the core of our ability to lead, or our ability to set an example. I'll give you another example. India's Right to Information Act was by far the most aggressive and most ambitious access to information act anywhere in the world. And Pakistan learned from it. Bangladesh learned from it. We, the, I partnered very briefly with the Commonwealth Human Rights Initiative, which was leading some of these trainings. And they were sending people to countries around our region who wanted to learn from this example. We were teaching. Today, the RTI has been constrained to such a degree that who would want to learn from us?
That's
You
true.
know, that. So what I'm saying is very simple. If we want to lead, we have to succeed.
Yeah.
Otherwise,
And
people will be happy to have us as a market, as
that's
somebody
it.
to sell cars to.
Hmm.
But we
And
don't get
that's
to
what
set
is
the
happening.
agenda. Yeah. The
And
the
Shivshankar
thing.
Menon
Mm,
sums it well.
yeah.
And he says that India seems to mistake controlling the narrative with creating outcomes, which is the real task of foreign and security policy. Prime Minister Modi has declared a goal of India to be a Vishwaguru or world teacher, which is a long way away what it is an importer of knowledge and technology, nor is it clear that this status will actually contribute to transforming the lives of Indian citizens, though it might satisfy the ego.
Yeah. So one of the needs of countries, by the way, when it comes to foreign policy, is pride and ego. I mean, I'm a great fan of Shiv Shankar Menon, so I won't diss him that much. But ego is not a small thing, right? People want to be proud of their country, but where I am in complete agreement with him is that unless you have something to be proud of, that pride is a castle of sand. The wave will come in and it'll all go away. So basically, this works both ways. Where India does well, when it does well, its power on the global stage increases. One's between the time that we had economic liberalization and today, our economic strength rose multiple fold. In doing so, we became far more powerful on the global stage because we could buy weapons, we could influence things, we could give loans, we could say, "Hey, you want to work with us, right?" But when our growth rate falls, when our unemployment rate rises, when people see disease and misery on the roads, we become objects of pity, not objects of power. Foreign policy and domestic strength cannot be delinked. And one of the things that I think a lot of people don't understand is that, in a sense, India in the 70s and 80s, actually, it was quite irrelevant on the global stage. We were not powerful actors. We became better actors at the neighborhood stage. But what it did allow us, because to a certain degree we were irrelevant and we weren't getting involved in wars globally, we were able to strengthen our own institutions to a certain degree. Indian democracy, kind of embedded itself. And then we were able to get, some of our election conduct going better. You had people like TN Session rise to positions of authority. Your institutional structures became a little better. And so by the time we got onto the world stage later in the 90s, we didn't just have to sell out our local, uh, our own domestic consideration. One of the problems when we look for glory on the world stage is in misunderstanding what we are able to deliver. And I'll give you an example of this. England is a rich country. It's a powerful country. It's linked to so many. It's a major actor in so many global institutions. It's got a seat on the UN Security Council. But in his lust for glory on foreign domains, Tony Blair tied up with Bush in the greatest international disaster of the last few decades, which was the illegal invasion of Iraq. And in trying to stand shoulder to shoulder with the US, whose power so outstrips the UK that it's not even imaginable, basically, the UK sold itself short, searching for glory in foreign policy when it should have been far more focused on domestic strengths. And that's a danger. And that's a danger that we can see in our neighborhood with Pakistan, which has so often tied itself to foreign policies of foreign actors, whether the US or the Gulf countries or now China, that it is not able to give the attention necessary to its own domestic constraints. That's a danger that we have when we look at foreign policy only as glory. Unless you're delivering uh, for your domestic strengths, foreign policy as a glory can be a good way to hurt your own country.
But uh, that's very well said, because you can relate it with China as well. I mean, how China was looked before it opened the economy, and post the success in the
Hmm,
last 3 decades, and
hmm,
how the perception of China has changed globally, and which is
hmm,
completely in link with its economic success and increasing its per capita income, GDP growth rate,
hmm,
infrastructure, almost everything.
hmm. And I'll give you an example from China. I think it was in 2010 when China had done all sorts of things in East Asia and Southeast Asia and gotten really badly spanked. Burma had opened up to the U.S. Uh, Vietnam had opposed it. So there were this group of Chinese academics that were visiting Delhi, and I was speaking to them. And one of them said, apropos anything, that we know it's not these countries that want to oppose us. We know who's really pushing this. They had so lost focus on their local strengths that they could not see that the issues of small countries were actually the pushback that they were receiving. They couldn't assess it properly. And that's one of the dangers of looking at foreign policy as this grand strategy, as this moment where we have arrived. It's a very careful balancing act. China has reversed a little on that, and with that reversal, it has engaged in different ways with, let's say, the countries of the Mekong, with Burma, with Bangladesh. For example, the Bangladesh Stock Exchange tied up with the Chinese. Why didn't it tie up with us? We lost out on that tie-up primarily because China has been far more successful in upping its trade with Bangladesh. And we may have been instrumental in helping Bangladesh achieve its independence. But for every country, what's important is its core interest, and their core interest is growth.
Mm. And we are not able to demonstrate that growth with Bangladesh, even though we have, there's a lot of trade that is happening with Bangladesh, but for some reason it has not upped.
Well, the simple reason that growth within India has fallen. We're not growing anywhere near what we were growing during uh, the length of the UPA 1 and UPA 2 years. And you just can't hide the fact that you don't have as much trade happening. And anyway, I mean, we cannot compete with China on those terms. They are far richer than us. And that's where the other thing that matters. Why was the non aligned movement able to stand for a little while? Okay, it splintered out, and I don't want to go on about it. But the non aligned movement had nothing in terms of power or wealth in comparison to the American led coalition or the Soviet led coalition. It was able to set an agenda that we were colonized countries. We do not want to be colonized countries. We want to be able to pursue our own best way forward. That was a, how would you call it, a Vishwaguru, or a a aspirational thing. Today, unfortunately, there is no such kind of aspirational leadership coming from any country. Today we live in a far more transactional world, but there is an opportunity, and that opportunity was there with, let's say, the Paris Climate Agreement. Currently, the biggest threat globally in terms of lives lost, in terms of trade lost, in terms of livelihoods lost, is climate change impacts. There is no country that is leading the fight on this. There is no country, there is no coalition which is saying that we have an answer to a how we create a better economy. And at the core of the Cold War, a lot of imperial and everything else aside, the challenge was the argument that we can create a better economy. And the US led order won that because it demonstrated it could create a better economy than the Soviet Union led order. Today, we are seeing that nobody is a leading voice on this. For a country like India, who's we're 150 million farmers, and with them, if you include their families and everybody else, about 700 million people are directly impacted by the way that rains patterns have changed. When we have one of the largest coastlines in the world, which and we border the warmest ocean in the world, which is the Indian Ocean, where millions of people are being displaced because of rising seas. Why is India not a leader when it's putting forward the idea of a better, more sustainable economic way forward? Why is it that bloody China gets to say it's creating an ecological civilization and we're nowhere in the scene? Why are we missing these opportunities?
See, it's not like what I feel is there have been some sectors where we have been leaders and where we have shown the way. Especially, we can talk about IT services and
Hmm.
also the startup innovation that India is offering. I mean, I understand it is yet to reach its epitome. Uh, but don't you think that we have had our share of successes there and we have shown the path there?
We have some successes, but I mean, a lot of, unfortunately, what our software industry has shown is just that we are doing the same things cheaper. It's not that we're innovating. To provide leadership, you must create something new. If our software industry was so good, why has it not been able to create platforms of the type that Google or Samsung is doing? Okay, Samsung, a lot of that is to do with light industry, and that's not an area where we're leading. But here's the thing: India will lead best when it deals with its own problems. So let's say our Mars mission, even if the lander failed to, at the last bit, the achievement of that was spectacular. There's very few countries that can achieve something like that. And the space program for us works really well because it's based on actually providing us information on weather patterns, which is necessary for our agriculture. So India leads when it deals with its own problems. When we can fix our problems and we can fix them well, that's when we are a leader.
So
So
a lot of answers globally is the questions globally are answers locally.
They have to be locally answered. So India has got, the Indian subcontinent has got so much biodiversity that it's only rivaled by the continent of Africa. But what do? हम सिर्फ bloody basmati chawal khate hain. We have, and understand that that the genetics, the genetic richness that is there in South Asia is unrivaled. Why are we not structuring our economy around such things? So, I mean, I am so incredibly happy that the Manipuri black rice is being recognized as, a classic staple, right? As a superfood. But we have so many of these things, but we're not paying attention to them. And a lot of the reason why we're not paying attention to them is because too much of our innovation and access to loans, our access to institutions and all of that is locked into our big urban areas and our neglected hinterland, where a lot of these things come from, are being overlooked. If venture capitalists are only putting money in Bangalore, how much can Bangalore produce? And one of the reasons why people are putting money into these big cities is, at least, there's at least they know that they're not going to be cheated or looted, or at least not too much, and they have access to some forms of legal help and all of that. But for much of India, the idea of working markets, of contracts being honored is just not there. And so until we fix India, until we deal with our own challenges, chasing glory overseas will be out of our reach.
So we can do these impressive events that we do abroad,
Hmm,
but on ground it's meaningless. Because number one, they are not contributing to domestic success.
hmm.
Second of all, we have not fixed a problem, because so that we actually lead in certain areas, and we can demonstrate success as well. So
Yeah.
this
So
is optics.
if we are able to show demonstrated success from the ground, let's say Kerala's handling of the coronavirus pandemic, then those become our calling cards to global leadership. But
Learn from
if,
us.
yeah, learn from us because we're worth learning from.
And
But
that is when you become a Vishwaguru.
yeah, but if the film that wins the Oscar is a Slumdog Millionaire, which shows a boy from a slum diving into a pile of shit, who wants to learn from that? Oh, by the way, on that note, Bollywood's been a great Vishwaguru. Yeah,
Mhm.
पाकिस्तान में हमारे
Totally.
pirated movies बिकते हैं यार. And why? Because
Somewhere we
it's
can
successful.
claim dominance.
And not just Bollywood, Bollywood itself learns from South Indian movie creators,
Correct.
right? And the root of a lot of early Bollywood success was the art and music that had come from various gharanas. All that poetry, all those things that are our own strength. That's how you become a Vishwa. You celebrate and strengthen your own traditions.
Omer, I would like to spend some time, speaking about what's happening globally, and
Sure.
how are we engaging with different nation states across the world specifically. I
Okay.
would like to ask, start with this line again from the same Shiv Shankar Menon paper. By the way, what a fantastic paper, and thanks for sharing it to me. And I will also share the link to listeners in the show notes, and they can
Yeah.
access it later.
Please, please
So
do.
yeah, Mr. Menon says the world is multipolar economically, still unipolar in military terms, but confused politically.
Okay. So one of my professors, Varun Sahni, uh, he had the best dismissal of the term unipolar. He said, "Dekho, uh, you understand where the term polar comes from. It comes from magnets. No magnet has one pole. By definition, you have to have more than one pole." So
Correct.
I, there was, after the fall of the Soviet Union, there was the idea of America as a unipolar, or the world as a unipolar moment, where America was the only leader. This was, I think, a critically, misunderstood idea. You can't. The Cold War worked in a way that you had two pulls and pushes. Once that one pull factor had gone, the other could neither pull nor push as much, even though it was far, far more powerful. America is incredibly powerful. America's military and economic might is unrivaled by anything the world has ever seen. At the same time, why is it pulling out of Afghanistan?
Hmm.
Because it won?
Correct.
I mean, it didn't win. We don't know what it did. They don't know what it
And multiple
did.
administrations failed. It's not just like, it's the, end road of one administration. Obama was not successful, and then.
Look, the the problem with Afghanistan, with the American Afghanistan misadventure, was that they never actually defined what their end goal was. In terms of defeating the Taliban, they were successful. They did it in like a couple of months. They won the war. Then they just sat there. What were they going to do? I mean, Laura Bush was talking about, converting Afghanistan into like a functioning democracy. It was like how they talked about Iraq, where the people would welcome with them with rose petals. It was these were bizarre fantasies. They had no relationship to the world as it was because they had drank the Kool-Aid that they were the unipole. They could do anything. The What Menon is referring to, and I, despite the fact that I disagree with him on the unipolar thing, is that there is only one country in the world which has a power to project its power globally. One of the challenges in both Iraq and Afghanistan, even though these were supposed to be multilateral interventions, was that without the American carry and command facilities, this is basically connecting troops across by communications or by air, none of the other countries could provide that. Europe doesn't spend enough. None of these smaller countries have the have spent enough to create that kind of military force. China has possibly enough power now to limit America getting into some of its areas, but that's about it. China is not a global power in the same way either. There's an excellent foreign policy book that I'll recommend, and which you should read, by David Shambo. He is one of the best China hands that I know of, and in 2013 he wrote this great book called China Goes Global: The Partial Power, and he demonstrated how in real term matrices, whether it's economic might, military might, ability to project power, China was nowhere near where America was, and the idea of it being a global power was still largely an idea. I Please read that book. It's great. It's really
I
what
will.
it got him deeply hated in China, where previously he had been deeply respected. But it's really a powerful book. Um, so you have only one country that has this capability, militarily, economically. But that capability can only work if you have other people aligning with you. To a certain degree, they will align with you because their interests and your interests converge. But since the presidency of George W. Bush, America has largely been retreating from global institutions. It tried briefly, it tried actually, not just briefly, but a lot under Obama to build new institutions, the Paris Climate Agreement being one of the biggest ones, but also an Asian pivot. Unfortunately, Trump has, you know, undermined all of that very, very quickly. It's much easier to destroy than it is to build. So the problem with America is that it has a power, but it increasingly doesn't have the institutions to be able to get other people on board to go along with it. So it can't project that power. And because it can't project that power, there's a lot of areas which are just non governance areas. And unfortunately, with the rise of leaders, authoritarian nationalist leaders such as Bolsonaro, Erdogan, uh, there, Netanyahu, these are people that will not build institutions. They are very much small transaction. I mean, Erdogan tried earlier with a 360-degree policy, and has gone the same way as his initial uh, idea of a liberal thing. But what we miss right now globally is a map on how people can project their power. And as America systematically destroys the institutions that it built by pursuing a much more short term transactional policy under Trump, those institutions crumble not only for America, they crumble for the other actors as well. And that's where China is trying to project itself under the BRI initiative. So the BRI initiative is actually much more important as an institution to project and to align power in what are win-win relationships. Maybe a bigger win for China, but still smaller wins for the countries that are aligning with it. But it creates an alternative order. Unfortunately or fortunately in both ways, because I'm not a fan of the Chinese political system. Um, China has nowhere near the power, nor is it a regime that a lot of people admire. So it cannot build that institutional order. And even more unfortunately, countries like India, which could have tried to build an initiative of a different institutional order, are not doing so. That's why I was saying my earlier conversation about presenting an alternative way of governing the world is so important. And the lack of that means that we are not able to align people along the sides. So that in fact the energies of one country are 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 wasted. If you have five countries, even if they're smaller countries, they can come together and make something. But if you only have one country, no matter how powerful, that falls. That doesn't work.
So moving to some specific relationships that India has had, and
Hmm,
one of I would like to start with India's relationship with Russia. And
hmm.
clearly, this is one partner which has stood the test of time. And 70 years of diplomatic relationship started even 2 days before independence, 13th August 1947, and recently celebrated 70. The 70 years with Modi and Putin. Uh, but what we have seen is that we have started seeing less of Russia, and it has just reduced to a defense partner. Although they have set economic targets as well, but in general, there's not a lot of Russia in conversation. Is it because Russia doesn't have is anything more to offer to India anymore? Or is it just we have now been closer to the US and it's a policy shift and that's about it?
Well, one of the things you have to take into consideration is that Russia economically has become smaller and smaller. Russia is, and with that with the lack of economic growth, Russia's ability to project its power is limited more to military and the military diplomatic space, which it's very good at. The other problem with Russia, actually dealing with Russia right now, is, and this you have to look at it in terms of history. Uh, the end of the Cold War wasn't just a defeat for the Soviet Union. It was also Russia trying to find a dignified defeat. And it opened up to the American led order saying, okay, our systems didn't work, you help us, and we'll learn from you. And what happened was, frankly, the looting of Russia by large economic interests. And this wasn't, I don't think this was strategically done, but it was more a kind of failure of, uh, of vision by America and Europe. Europe, because it was concentrated in trying to rebuild itself. America, because once it had won the war, it was it got lost in navel gazing. Now the difference between this and, let's say, the end of World War II, where America launched a Marshall Fund in Europe, which helped Europe rebuild itself, is huge. In that sense, Russia felt cheated and betrayed. And what has happened under the leadership of Putin is basically Russia has said that, okay, if we are not going to get dignity and respect from the global order which America leads, we are going to undercut it. In that sense, Russia is, if we go back to the kind of institutional building, Russia is an actor that has limited power, but it has a power to undercut institutions. It has the power to undermine American strategic space in Syria, in the Middle East. For us to align with Russia, we don't have something on which to align with Russia too. The one thing that Russia has made very clear is that it will protect its own sovereignty and the sovereignty of its client states. That's that. How do you partner with that? What's there to do?
Hmm.
So there isn't much when it comes to Russia in terms of a way forward. That's the challenge with Russia.
So the larger idea would be just maintain the status quo, maintain that good fond relationship that you have developed over the course of time. You sooner or later ask them for maybe favors and veto. I don't know if they're still vetoing on our behalf, and keep it going as it is. So there's
Yeah,
no
no,
positive and then there's no negative.
yeah, it's at best, and again, Russia is far away from us in terms of physical space. So where do we abut Russia? The one place where we have where we have possible challenges is Afghanistan. So we maintain a relationship with them. The defense of sovereignty issue is something that we will use for Kashmir, and we will trade with them on that. But it's a very transactional relationship as of the moment. I don't see it moving forward, not under Putin.
Do you see these things as as threats or disappointments when you see Russia and Pakistan doing joint military drills in Gilgit and in some parts of Pakistan occupied Kashmir?
It is a threat to us because what it shows is Russia telling us, don't get too close to the Americans.
No, indirectly.
Yeah. But they're not going to back Pakistan against us. That's not in their interest at all. But
Hmm.
they may sell them weapons, which would be problematic for us. Our challenge with managing Russia will largely be Afghanistan. That's where it's really important that we have them on side, and they're not on side with Pakistan and China.
What does Russia wants out of Afghanistan? What is its ultimate objective?
So Russia has a what is bottom line objective. It doesn't want militant violence from Afghanistan coming into Russian territories. It had its Chechen insurgency. It has had a number of other insurgencies in Dagestan and other areas which bordered the Central Asian thing. So it doesn't want uncontrolled militancy in Afghanistan, which is something that works in our interest. That's one thing. But the other thing is that it doesn't want America to be a important player in the Central Asian region because it sees Central Asia as its backyard. It's the same reason that it reacted so strongly to Ukraine. It sees the former Warsaw countries as its backyard, and it wants America out as a powerful player. Beyond that, nothing. No major strategic interests.
Moving to Israel, and
Right.
I mean, we have seen we established diplomatic relationship with them in 1992, and then that has been a slow and steady progression. But there has been a very dramatic shift between India and Israel, yeah, in since Modi years, and with Modi being one of the first prime ministers to go, sitting prime minister to go to Israel, joint military cooperation, so much of defense, aerospace. Are we seeing Israel as an alternate to the, maybe a counterpole to China, Pakistan, like India, Israel, or are we really hopeful for that relationship, or where is it going?
Uh, I wouldn't read that much into it. Part of it is the same kind of relationship with people like Bolsonaro. It's like he had him as a Republic Day guest, but what are we going to get from Brazil, honestly, under Bolsonaro? Not much. You may have certain areas where you're blocking uh, initiatives that are similar. I mean, unfortunately, both uh, Netanyahu and Modi and Bolsonaro share a certain anti NGO, anti rights based discourse, which is okay. So you're able to build a on the political level a certain thing against having let's say European ideas of human rights being upheld. I don't see that as necessarily a win. And Israel's political power on the world stage is not. I mean, come on, it's a small country, right? Small Mediterranean country. It doesn't have that much power globally. It has certain amount of power due to its very close relationship to the U.S. And so we're happy. And the relationship actually took off during the Vajpayee years, though it was far more calibrated. Part of that relationship is linked to the Gulf relationship. So the Gulf states have also become far more closer to Israel over the last decade, and this is partially, MBZ, Mohammed bin Zayed, out of uh, the Emirates, and people like that. It's not a
Very
big
important actor.
it's not a big enough actor on that sense. The other sense that it is a big actor is that a lot of Indians admire how Israel has dealt with militancy. Uh, I, many Israelis don't share that enthusiasm. And there's a great documentary, I think, called The Gatekeepers, where successive Mossad chiefs have talked about how Israel's dealing with militancy has been largely failure. But in terms of technical success, whether it comes to drones, whether it comes to surveillance and other equipment, Israel is a world leader when it comes to militarily and technically managing militancy. So it's become a massive arms supplier to India, partially because what a large number of policymakers in India believe that instead of solving militancy by finding political solutions, all we need to do is make sure we kill enough of the militants that the problem doesn't become too big, and that we have enough surveillance in place that the militancy is ghetto sized to small areas. And as I said, a lot of Mossad doesn't agree with this, so it's kind of funny that we do, but ठीक है, चलो, everyone to their own.
Moving to a very interesting last three actors remaining: US, China, and Pakistan. So starting from US, and we have had a share of ups and downs with them since liberalization. I
Mm,
mean, we had there were sanctions when we did our nuclear test, and then there was the crisis during Kargil, Bill Clinton's visit, and then the legendary US nuclear deal with Manmohan Singh,
mm,
uh, who led overall led the way. Overall, now if you ask an average Indian, there is a very positive sentiment towards US, and they said that, yeah, India and US is on the way. But
mm.
clearly, like we mentioned in the initial part of the discussion as well, that our interests don't align. But we keep having these events where we're talking about Howdy Modi and Namaste Trump, and again, a lot of noise around India US relationships. There's Madison Square, and then there is also Modi speaking at the Congress. So, what do you make of everything? I mean, it's I know it's complicated, and US has also done a few bit of share for India. Like, for example, it has upped India's status in terms of in terms of certain levels of partnerships. But we have Trump at the White House now. So, in the context of how our relationships have developed in the last 20 years, what it is now, where do you see this going?
That's a big question. A lot of that depends whether Trump stays in the White House and what the next administration is like. Um, one part of it is that institutionally, India has gotten far closer to the United States in since 1998, since our nuclear test. And both India and the US understand each other to a certain degree better. Our biggest alignment happened from, let's say, 98 to, let's say, the end of the Obama years. And that was because India was seen by the US as a rising power, a necessary country when it came to dealing with China's rise in the world,
Balancing of power.
as a balancing power, but also as a stable actor that could guarantee security across what the Indian Ocean region. So, one way of looking at India from the American lens is to look at it from the naval perspective. And if you look at the naval reach of India from the Cape of Good Hope to the Malacca Straits, we have a huge, massive reach. And we're an important security provider in that whole region. In the South China Sea, we have a conflict with China, let's say, as China expands its naval horizons. And China now has a port access in Sri Lanka, and it doesn't like the term Indian Ocean. But so, in terms of naval cooperation, forget all the Trump stuff and everything else. India has continued to grow closer and closer institutionally with the American military and with America overall. And I think that will continue. And also remember that about 80% of world trade is through shipping. So having the ship lanes stable and safe is a major issue for all large trading communities. And that includes America, that includes India, that includes even China. So we are a major actor there, and I do not see that uh, going down. Where I see a challenge for India, and it is the fact that the greatest benefits we received with our relationship to the US was the Americans opening up doors for us to get into institutions. That gave us a seat at the table to decide on a lot of things. Within the Modi years, the only success on that has been MTCR, and that was largely because we traded back the Italian soldiers that had killed our fishermen, and so Italy stopped blocking us. Other than that, America is happy to have us on board, but it's not really pushing for us. And what's worse is that the Trump White House is actively attacking these institutions. So if you weaken the UN, if you weaken the WHO, what it weakens India's power in these institutions as well. right? Like, let me give you an example. SARC largely doesn't work, but if SARC worked, India would be able to leverage its power there, and therefore the big challenge for us isn't so much the howdy Modi and whatever hello Trump whatever events. Uh, the big challenge for us is where are the doors opening for us at institutional levels. Now, the big talk was always a quadrilateral. This is America, India, Japan, and Australia teaming up to create a large naval and security zone, which to a certain degree excluded China. That has come kind of, the steam has gone out of it. And largely because currently the US administration is paying zero attention to these areas. It just doesn't seem to care. Infrastructurally, institutionally, the US Navy continues to get closer to us. We continue to have a stronger relationship, but it's a little unsure where it's going. We'll know better in a year's time, let's just say.
And what has been the outputs of such grand visits like Howdy Modi in Texas, etc.? Do we get to know about it or not?
There might have been some deals behind the scenes, but I haven't seen any outcomes.
Right. And what is the biggest threat that you see to this relationship? I mean, and how do you say that, if India does not makes this move right, it can damage India-US relationship? Now, understanding that there are elections coming up there, so a lot of things are dependent. But considering Trump is re-elected and things are as it is.
So our biggest thing in keeping the Americans sweet is Afghanistan right now. In terms of our particular interests, we want Afghanistan to be a safe space. We want, even if the Americans do a deal with the Taliban, which they seem increasingly willing to do, we want some level of American oversight. So the Taliban, I mean, they're always going to, they're the Taliban. They're not going to abide by the deals. I'm sorry, but when they break those red lines, the only country that would keep them in their place in a way that would be aligned with Indian interests would be the U.S. So our biggest closest challenge right now is Afghanistan. I don't see in terms of any other thing where India or the US where either country would do anything that would undermine the relationship. I, there isn't there isn't anything else that I can see. Can you see anything? Is there something that you think that the Americans would do that would hurt us? I mean, there's nothing in their self-interest that they would do that would hurt us, and there's
Mm,
nothing in our self-interest that we could do that would. I mean, the only thing that we could do that would possibly offend them deeply would be to start trading with Iran again, but that's about it.
and how does India see Trump and the uncertainty that he brings on the table?
Well, different people see it differently. In one sense, he's an opportunity because he's very much a person whose vanity and ego is on his sleeve, and it's easy to massage that ego. And because he's an important decision maker. But the other problem is that he is not a disciplined decision maker. So he doesn't seem to drive policy forward in any coherent way. One of the big things that people miss out is that if Trump was really wanted to use all of the powers that are with the White House, he could have done a lot more in a lot more damaging way. He hasn't been able to, partially because he himself doesn't believe in institutions, and so he hasn't been able to use those institutions very well. So I think within India, within the Indian establishment, there are two aspects to it. One is that Trump is somebody that we can manage through his ego, and two, that the we're not necessarily going to get much good or bad out of this relationship while he's in the White House.
What I see, and the way I see US and India is, they will always, they're always open for cooperations. But when we talk about our interest, let's say in Pakistan, or asking US to stop using the term India administered Kashmir,
Hmm.
they will never, they will never comply. Uh, when they'll keep funding Pakistan, saying, knowing that there's a state sponsored terrorism going on there, and the funding might have reduced over the course of years, but on paper Pakistan is still an ally, and
Yeah.
they want to increase closeness, and it's selling weapons to us, it is selling weapons to them. And so I see them, they have not really done something above and beyond for us. It has been good relationship which has been gone better, but
Hmm.
not something which is very extraordinary. Is it a fair
Well,
assumption?
I think the Americans under both W and Obama did go beyond the ordinary. And they saw India as a primary part of the strategic landscape. It's of course in their self-interest. Let's keep it that way. That doesn't mean that they will abandon their strategic interests. And they couldn't abandon Pakistan because, frankly, 85% of their flow to maintaining their army and capability in Afghanistan went through Pakistan. So why abandon it? So they had to work with them to a certain degree, but there was a huge shift between the W and the Obama years to before that. That said, the question will always down to what is in their self interest and what is in our self interest. Why should they do anything for us which is against their self interest? No country will do that. And the second thing is when it comes to, let's say, issues of Kashmir and all of that, uh, the problem for us is that we don't have a good argument. If we are suspending democracy in all real terms in Kashmir, why why would the Americans go out of their way to say no? Okay, India is right in all that it does. We're not. We don't have the close ties, the kind of cultural pull and the link and the personal linkages that, let's say, Israel has with America. That Israel can afford to run an apartheid policy in the Palestinian territories, and the Americans won't. American presidential candidates will line up to say, "I'm a Zionist." So we're not that closely interlinked with them. So, and I think even the Israelis are finding it more difficult over time, as increasing numbers of American Jews are disgusted with Israeli policies in the Palestinian territory. So, when it comes to Kashmir, frankly, the only way forward for us on how to deal with that is to repair our own relationship with Kashmiris. Until we do that, frankly, whether people condemn us from outside or they praise us from outside, it doesn't matter. Our challenge is internal. I mean, frankly, the only thing that Pakistan is doing is utilizing our problem. If we didn't have those problems, Pakistan would be irrelevant in Kashmir, and that's Pakistan. I mean, in 1965, uh, Sheikh Abdullah was in jail. Everything was all that. They infiltrated a whole bunch of spies into Kashmir, hoping to spark off an insurrection so India could not supply its military forces on the Western Front. And largely the Kashmiris just turned these people over to Indian authorities and they ended up in jail. And look at where we are today. So when it comes to Kashmir, our challenges are not America. They're not Europe. They're not international journalism. Pakistan is now, unfortunately, a deeply entrenched problem. So I won't say that Pakistan isn't an issue, but it's nowhere near as much of an issue uh, as our own relationship with a state that we call our own.
Moving towards and switching gears and moving towards a very important actor in world affairs right now and most talked about is China.
Hmm.
And define the love hate relationship with India and China if you can.
Okay, so well, it's kind of it depends on what side. If you look from the Indian side, we spend a lot more attention on China than China does it to us. China is largely looking at America. Every country looks at the bigger country that it sees as its challenge. Um, with China, basically, India had thought that China and India could be a partners that were former colonized countries that wanted a world order that respected them and that helped them grow and that pursued their own particular pathways. Now, I mean, one of the things that for us, let's say the 62 war is a big thing. For the Chinese, the 62 war doesn't really exist on their mental horizon because at that time when the 62 war happened, China was going through the Great Leap Forward in which 30 to 40 million Chinese starved to death.
Died. Yeah.
Yeah. Many villages were reduced to absolute starvation. Some even resorted to cannibalism to stay alive. So, in that view of thought, the 62 war, in terms of China, was for the Chinese leadership to assert its power when it had done this huge, massive debacle inside. In For India, we saw this as a great betrayal, and we were completely unprepared. We didn't know what to do with it. But you also have to realize that what happened in the 62 war, in the aftermath, is that China retreated back to its positions very quickly, and to a certain degree, the 62 war was sparked off by our own forward policy, where India had decided that it would aggressively patrol areas that it says it had controlled, and which China also claimed. Now, the kind of silly thing about it is that the border between India and China, which is not acknowledged by either country, is primarily an outcome of colonialism. So in a way, we're fighting the white man's war long after the white man has left.
Well, we're doing it for a lot of boundaries there.
And it's like, yeah, kya bakwas hai yaar? I mean, the whole Middle East could be said to be that. But
Mm.
it's the other aspect to it is that you have to realize is that in real terms, the boundary between India and China is, even if it's 4,000 kilometers long, is not a big deal. Neither country really aggressively wants what's on the other side. It's not like our issue with Kashmir when it comes to Pakistan. Neither we nor they aggressively claim or aggressively try to change the status quo, and that has maintained itself for decades now.
But can we
We
trust them really?
no, nobody can trust anybody, right? Let's not say in terms of trust. We look in terms of their self-interest, and we look in terms of our self-interest. Do we really want anything on the Chinese side when it comes to the boundary?
Not really.
Not really. Is there anything they would get in invading Ladakh or Sikkim or the Northeast? They
I
would
mean,
just stretch their
but
lines and wrap themselves
yeah,
into a massive insurgency. What they gain by building up across that whole area is an ability to possibly bully us, to make us uncomfortable. But that's about it. I mean, the Chinese in the 60s had to a certain degree supplied ammunition and support to militants in the Northeast. They haven't done that since then. It's been decades. If they really wanted to make our lives miserable, they would be backing the NSCN and other, militant networks in the Northeast. So, in real terms, if you just want to look in terms of evidence, forget about trusting or not trusting. Nobody goes by trust when it comes to foreign relations. In terms of sheer evidence, if China wanted to, they could make our lives far more miserable. They have not done so because it's not in their self-interest. We are a substantial trading partner for them. They are I think, our number one trading partner.
Yeah.
So we don't see, or no, America is, and they're number two, I think. Whatever, I forget exactly the numbers. But particular point where we are fighting with each other on the land borders. On the sea borders, we have issues with them claiming the South China Sea, and then getting into Sri Lanka and the Indian Ocean. Are we going to fight a war over it? Unlikely. These are still, at the bureaucratic, the Japanese or the Vietnamese, and we have not ever, neither the Chinese Navy nor the Indian Navy has basically ever gotten to the point where we'll be firing shells on each other or uh, having our planes fly close to each other. That's not on the mandate. So, in terms of our basic problem with China is that China sees itself as a global actor centered in Asia, and it does not, and it sees India as a speed bump in that. What India does not want is for China to set the terms of relationships in Asia. We don't want of Asia. That is the crux of the problem. And we do not have a way in which we can regulate our relationship with each other. We have a dialogue that's at National Security Advisor level from India and China, which is largely to do with our unresolved border, but it also incorporates a lot of other things. But the real challenge when it comes to China and India is who sets the terms of how countries will behave with each other in Asia. India, with its alliance structure with America, Japan, Australia, and other countries, could prove to be the one country in Asia that can challenge a Chinese-led order. China is, with its behind other systems, could lock India out of much of Asia. That's the crux problem.
So, a couple of questions there. I think the one question is: are you suggesting that the dispute? So, first point first. Are you suggesting that the dispute at Arunachal Pradesh is just the white man's problem, and if we really sit across the table, we can really solve it?
Most borders.
There was a small technical error which led to an audio loss of approximately 5 minutes. When we resume, we will be talking about India's Act East policy. Sorry for the inconvenience.
So should we start? Okay.
We are recording again. Thank you so
All
much.
right.
Yeah. So Ministry of
Yeah, so this
MEA.
former Secretary West of the Ministry of External Affairs, we were both talking at Didi on Modi's visit to Bhutan, on his first visit to Bhutan, and I said that the trip was heavy on optics, not so heavy on content, and that needed to change. And so this guy got really angry with me and said, Modi understands the Act East policy better than, and the Northeast better than anybody else. And so here's the thing: for us to be able to really make our Act East policy work, we need to make the Northeast work. And part of that seemed to be happening with our highway through the Southeast Asia, which I want to drive on. By the way, it looks awesome. But the problem is that right now our Northeast doesn't work. And our Northeast doesn't work primarily because we went through this massive NRC exercise. So here's the thing: for India to project its power, it needs to be domestically secure. You cannot have policies that completely throw major states within the country for a loop and then be able to project power overseas. And so, right now, across Southeast Asia, if we are going to project our power, we have two major issues. One is the NRC issue, which hasn't been resolved, and the second is the Rohingya crisis, which hasn't been resolved by Myanmar. So, how are we going to pursue a more active Southeast Asia policy if we've got these bottlenecks?
But Omair, to the benefit of doubt of the government, so NRC was just in Assam, but there's multiple other states which were not a part of NRC exercise. Do you think still it
Yeah,
matters?
Assam is the biggest state in the Northeast. Yeah, it's massive, and it affects all of the smaller states around when these things happen. It would have been the launching pad for much of what of trade into Southeast Asia. What we need is stability, and we need growth internally. So who's going to lead? Manipur, Arunachal Pradesh, Nagaland, Mizoram? They don't. You need all of these states to be working together. And if the biggest state in the Northeast, Assam, is in upheaval, how are you going to do it? That's a big challenge. It's.
Which comes back to our
I mean,
original point.
yeah. I mean, look, you cannot delink domestic stability and growth and foreign policy
Correct. Correct.
both ways. Foreign policy has to work for this, and domestic growth and strengthen foreign policy. If one part of that bit doesn't work, then we're just talking in the air. It might be nice for our ego, but it doesn't help us.
What happens when you make these remarks and a government official would just piss somebody off? Because I mean, clearly the way you are telling this particular narrative, it feels that the whole ministry is not very savvy of feedback.
Well, let's say I'm not. I'm not. I have friends in the MEA and in the in security services and there. I have former raw officials who will write to me and say, completely agree with you, and here's our analysis on the same thing. But this current government does not do well when it comes to listening to criticism.
uh,
And so, I have friends in the PMO who will say, yeah, there are problems, but they also have to justify their work, right?
allegiance as well.
Yeah, and everyone would like to believe that they're doing the best possible job. And look,
Mm.
again, let's give people benefit of the doubt and everything else. Everybody. I don't have access to confidential files. What we're Everything that we've talked about right now is stuff that you can access or double check. There are things I know that I'm not talking about because they happened in confidential meetings, and I cannot share those. But if what I'm saying, look, somebody like Sham Saran, former foreign secretary, former chief negotiator with the U.S., our envoy to the U.S. after he was foreign secretary, has written very clearly in a number of articles for the Indian Express that until and unless we have internal stability, our foreign policy abilities will continue to weaken. This is not rocket science. It is 1 + 1 = 2. This is how foreign policy is. You can delude yourself. I mean, the Americans deluded themselves. I think it was Wolfowitz that said something along the lines that we don't need to read history, we're making it. Well, you can delude yourself about foreign policy, but what you end up doing is making a massive mess. And it can seem successful for a while. I mean, W got onto that aircraft carrier and said, mission accomplished. The Taliban were defeated, but it's the long term that counts.
Because of technical errors, I have to cut down on the show. But what an episode. Refreshing. I never looked at foreign policy like this. And what a brilliant message Omair gave to us that to lead the world, we first have to lead ourselves. Well, disappointingly, we have to stop the show in the middle, and now my apologies. After stopping the show, I spoke to Omair and I said that I'm sad that we could not discuss Pakistan. You know what he said? He said, "यार Pakistan से क्या मतलब है? Meaningless country है." I think that pretty much sums up of how we should look at our dear neighbor. Omair also made a very important remark that there are less women on my show. So I have made an agenda that between 15 June and 31st July, I will bring episodes for you which will only have women. I learn so much from my guests. I love podcasting. And more every day, I fall in love with this small little hobby that I started 3 months ago. If you love Lights Camera Azadi, please share your feedback. You can write to me on Twitter. My Twitter handle is THOONEDIT. You can also email your feedback to me on vandit.jain@outlook.com. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel, Lights Camera Azadi, and follow us on Instagram on Lights Camera Azadi. Thank you so much for tuning in. Stay home, stay safe. Dhanyavad. Jai Hind.